London, 1851. The hushed voices floated through the air like spectral whispers, swirling around Winifred Kingston as she stood frozen in the corner of Lady Harlington's grand ballroom. Though her face remained impassive, her throat constricted painfully as familiar words reached her ears: scandal, disgrace, father, ruin. These were the companions of her existence now, following her from room to room, house to house, clinging to her skirts like burrs. Did you hear? Her father embezzled the funds from half the gentlemen in Parliament before fleeing to the continent, and left his daughter to bear the shame. How utterly fascinating. They say she hasn't spoken a word since the scandal broke. Not a single word. Perhaps she's simple, or perhaps she knows her words would only condemn her further. Winifred's gloved fingers tightened around her fan, the delicate ivory ribs digging into her palm. She had not, in fact, spoken a word in the 3 months since her father's crimes had been splashed across the front page of every newspaper in London. But her silence was not born of simplicity or guilt. It was her armor, her only protection against a world that had already judged and condemned her. What good were words when they fell upon deaf ears? What purpose did her voice serve when no one would believe in her innocence? She had learned that lesson the night the constables had come, when her protestations of ignorance about her father's financial dealings had been met with sneers and disbelief. The silence had begun as shock, transformed into necessity, and had finally become her choice. If society wished to create its own narrative about her, then she would deny them the satisfaction of her words. They could speculate about her thoughts, her feelings, her complicity, but they would never again twist her words against her. Lady Harlington had invited her tonight only out of obligation to Winifred's late mother, who had once been the lady's dearest friend. The invitation had arrived with a coldly worded note suggesting that perhaps a reintroduction to society might begin the work of rehabilitation. As if Winifred were an invalid requiring treatment rather than a woman who had lost everything through no fault of her own. She edged toward the doors leading to the terrace, desperate for air untainted by judgment. The path was clear until it wasn't. Miss Kingston. The deep voice halted her retreat. She turned slowly, raising her eyes to meet those of the gentleman who had addressed her. Her breath caught. Before her stood the Duke of Carlisle, Connor Irvington, his tall frame silhouetted against the golden glow of the ballroom's chandeliers. The Duke's reputation preceded him, brilliant, stern, uncompromising. His dark hair was swept back from a broad forehead, his jawline sharp and commanding. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, grey as a winter sky and currently narrowed in assessment as they studied her face. "You don't remember me," he stated. It wasn't a question. Winifred's heart hammered against her ribs. She did remember him, how could she not? 3 years prior, before her father's disgrace, the Duke had visited their home to discuss business matters. She had served tea, her hands trembling under his intense gaze. He had been polite but distant, and had departed without ceremony. What could he possibly want with her now? She offered a brief curtsy, her eyes lowered, and made to step around him. "Your silence speaks volumes, Miss Kingston," he continued, shifting to block her path. "But I wonder, is it shame that binds your tongue or something else entirely?" His words were not spoken with cruelty, but with a curious intensity that made her pause. She met his gaze directly, allowing her eyes to convey what her voice could not: defiance, dignity, determination. A flicker of surprise crossed his features. "Interesting," he murmured. "Not shame, then, perhaps wisdom." Winifred inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his perception. She gestured toward the terrace doors, silently requesting passage. "By all means," he said, stepping aside. "But before you go, I have a proposition for you." She froze, her shoulders stiffening. Propositions from gentlemen, particularly those of high rank, rarely ended well for women in her position, disgraced, destitute, desperate. As if reading her thoughts, the Duke's expression hardened. "Not that kind of proposition, Miss Kingston. I require a governess for my ward, my late cousin's daughter. She has difficulties with speech. I believe someone who understands the power of silence might be better equipped to help her than those who insist upon constant chatter. Winifred blinked rapidly, astonishment washing over her. A position. An actual, respectable position, after months of closed doors and returned letters, after selling nearly every possession to keep a roof over her head. But the moment of hope faltered. What game was the Duke playing? Surely he knew that bringing a woman associated with scandal into his household would invite gossip. "You're wondering why I would risk my reputation by employing you," he said, his voice lowered as a group of ladies passed nearby, their curious glances lingering on the unusual tableau of the Duke conversing with society's pariah. "Let me be clear. I do not care for society's opinions on matters that do not concern them. I care for results, Miss Kingston. My ward requires assistance that I believe you are uniquely qualified to provide. Nothing more, nothing less." He withdrew a card from his waistcoat pocket and extended it to her. "My address. Present yourself tomorrow at 10 o'clock if you're interested. If not," he shrugged one broad shoulder, "then I wish you good fortune in your endeavors." Winifred hesitated before accepting the card, the thick cream paper heavy between her fingers. She met his gaze once more, searching for deceit or ulterior motive, but found only straightforward expectation. With a final nod, the Duke turned and walked away, leaving Winifred staring after him, the card clutched in her hand like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair stirring in her chest. Hope was dangerous, hope could be crushed, but without it, what remained? She slipped the card into her reticule and made her way to the terrace, where the night air cooled her flushed cheeks. Tomorrow she would make her decision. Tonight she would allow herself to imagine a future beyond disgrace. The Duke's London residence, a massive Portland stone edifice in Mayfair, loomed before Winifred the following morning. She had arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, dressed in her most respectable gown, a navy blue wool that had once been her mother's and had been carefully altered to fit her slighter frame. She had spent the night deliberating, weighing the risks against the rewards. To enter the Duke's household was to invite new gossip, new speculation. But to refuse meant continuing her precarious existence, watching her meager funds dwindle until nothing remained. In the end, practicality had won over pride. The butler who answered her knock regarded her with barely concealed disapproval, but led her through the marble-floored entrance hall to a wood-paneled study where the Duke sat behind a massive desk, papers spread before him. He glanced up at her entrance, his expression revealing nothing. "Miss Kingston, you've come." She nodded, clutching her worn leather portfolio containing her letters of reference from before, when her name had still meant something. "Please sit." He gestured to the chair across from him, then dismissed the butler with a wave of his hand. When the door closed, leaving them alone, he leaned back and studied her face. "I trust you had no difficulty finding the house." Winifred shook her head, her gaze steady. "Good." He steepled his fingers. "Before we discuss terms, I should tell you about my ward. Lady Catherine Irvington is 8 years old. Her parents, my cousin and his wife, died in a carriage accident 2 years ago. Catherine was with them. She survived, but has not spoken since. The physicians can find no physical cause for her silence. They believe it to be a response to the trauma." Winifred's heart constricted with sympathy. She understood all too well how trauma could steal one's voice. "She has had 3 governesses in the past year," the Duke continued. "All dismissed because they could not, or would not, adapt to her needs. They insisted on verbal responses, on breaking through her silence, as if it were a wall to be torn down rather than a shield to be respected." He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her as he gazed out at the street below. "I won't pretend to understand the complexities of the female mind, Miss Kingston, but I do understand protective measures. Catherine's silence protects her from something, her memories, her fears, perhaps even her own feelings of guilt, misplaced though they may be." He turned back to face her. You have your own reasons for silence, I'm sure. I don't need to know them, but I believe you might understand my ward in ways others cannot. The question is, are you willing to try? To communicate without words, to teach without demanding speech. Winifred opened her portfolio and removed a small slate and chalk. She had purchased them that morning, anticipating this need. She wrote quickly, her script neat and precise. I understand silence. I will respect hers while teaching her to communicate in other ways. The Duke read her words, a flicker of approval crossing his face. Excellent. Now as to terms. The study door burst open, interrupting him. A small figure darted into the room, pursued by a harried-looking maid. My lord, I do apologize. Lady Catherine slipped away while I was preparing her lessons. It's quite all right, Mrs. Winters, the Duke said, his stern demeanor softening as the child rushed to his side, pressing herself against him. Catherine, we have discussed the importance of knocking before entering rooms. The girl looked up at him with enormous blue eyes, her golden curls framing a heart-shaped face. She showed no remorse for her intrusion, but instead turned her curious gaze to Winifred, studying her with an intensity unusual in one so young. Catherine, this is Miss Kingston. She may be your new governess. The child's eyes narrowed suspiciously. She crossed to Winifred's chair and stood before her, chin raised in unconscious mimicry of her guardian's authoritative stance. Winifred returned her gaze calmly, then reached for her slate. Rather than writing words, she drew a simple sketch, a little girl with curly hair, standing tall with a book in her hand. Catherine's eyes widened. She pointed to the drawing, then to herself, a question in her expression. Winifred nodded, then handed the chalk to the child. Without hesitation, Catherine added to the drawing, sketching a taller figure beside the girl, a woman with a slate of her own. Well, said the Duke, watching this silent exchange with evident surprise, it seems introductions have been made. Later that afternoon, after the terms of her employment had been settled, and Catherine had reluctantly been led away for her luncheon, Winifred found herself alone with the Duke once more. You made quite an impression, he said, sealing the letter of agreement they had crafted. Catherine rarely takes to anyone so quickly. Winifred wrote on her slate, children recognize kindred spirits. Indeed, he handed her the letter and a small advance on her first quarter's salary. You'll move in tomorrow. She nodded, relief washing through her. The position came with room and board. She could give notice on her shabby lodgings and still have enough to set aside for the future. One more thing, Miss Kingston. The Duke's voice grew serious. I am aware of the circumstances surrounding your father's departure. I know that you have maintained your innocence regarding knowledge of his activities. I believe you. Shock rendered Winifred motionless. He believed her when no one else had. However, he continued, others may not share my view. My household staff have been instructed to treat you with respect, but I cannot control the opinions of visitors or acquaintances. If you encounter any unpleasantness under my roof, I expect to be informed immediately. She wrote quickly, I have weathered worse storms than whispers, Your Grace. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I don't doubt it. Until tomorrow, then. As she departed the Duke's residence, Winifred felt something shift within her, a loosening of the knot that had formed in her chest the day her world had collapsed. She was not forgiven, not redeemed in the eyes of society, but she had been offered something nearly as valuable, an opportunity to prove herself through actions rather than words. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments. But for the first time in months, Winifred Kingston walked with her head held high, her step light with purpose. The weeks that followed saw Winifred settling into a rhythm at Carlisle House. Catherine proved to be a bright, if willful, pupil who thrived under Winifred's unconventional teaching methods. Together, they developed a system of communication, combining writing, drawing, and a collection of hand signals they invented for everyday needs. The Duke observed their progress with evident approval. though he maintained a careful distance, joining them occasionally for afternoon walks in the garden or briefly at tea time. He was, Winifred discovered, a man of rigid routine and exacting standards, but beneath his formal exterior lay unexpected depths of compassion, particularly where his ward was concerned. One evening, after Catherine had been put to bed, Winifred encountered the Duke in the library as she searched for a book on botanical illustrations to supplement the next day's science lesson. "Miss Kingston," he acknowledged her with a nod, closing the ledger he had been examining. "I trust Catherine is settled for the night." Winifred nodded, pulling her slate from her pocket. She asked for an extra story about the stars. "I could not refuse." A smile softened his features. "She has you wrapped around her finger already, I see." The acquiescence was worth it. "She is making excellent progress in mathematics, so I've noticed. Her confidence grows daily." He hesitated, then added, "As does yours." Winifred looked up sharply, questioning. "You move differently now," he explained. "When you first arrived, you seemed to want to disappear into the shadows. Now you walk as if you have a right to be here, which, of course, you do." His observation was unexpectedly perceptive, and Winifred felt color rising in her cheeks. She wrote, "I have always tried to carry myself with dignity." Dignity, yes, but now there's something more. He rose from his chair and approached the shelf where she stood, purpose, perhaps, or belonging. He was close enough now that she could detect the faint scent of sandalwood that clung to his clothing. His proximity was unsettling in ways she didn't care to examine too closely. Needing distance, she wrote, "I should return to my chambers. Tomorrow's lessons require preparation." The Duke stepped back immediately. "Of course." "Good night, Miss Kingston." As she reached the doorway, his voice stopped her. "Miss Kingston." She turned. "Catherine is not the only one who is flourishing under this arrangement." The cryptic comment followed her back to her room, where she lay awake far longer than she should have, puzzling over his words and the strange warmth they had kindled within her. Autumn deepened into winter, and with it came a series of challenges that tested the fragile peace Winifred had found at Carlisle House. First was the arrival of the Duke's sister, Lady Victoria Pennington, a fashionable widow whose sharp eyes missed nothing, especially not the way her brother's gaze tended to linger on the governess when he thought no one was watching. "Really, Connor, a governess with a scandalous past. You're practically begging for gossip," Victoria remarked one evening when she thought Winifred had left the drawing room. "Especially when you look at her as if she were a rare book you're desperate to read." "Mind your own affairs, Vicky," came the Duke's terse reply. "Miss Kingston's past is irrelevant to her current position. She has proven herself more than capable." "Capable, yes, and rather pretty too, in that quiet, mysterious way. One might almost suspect you hired her for reasons beyond her educational qualifications." "That's quite enough." Winifred had slipped away then, her cheeks burning with mortification. She had no illusions about her position or her prospects. The gulf between herself and the Duke was vast and unbridgeable, and she would not allow herself to entertain foolish fantasies simply because he had shown her basic human kindness. The second challenge came in the form of a letter from her father's solicitor, informing her that creditors were still pursuing claims against what remained of her father's estate, including the small cottage in Derbyshire that had been her mother's dowry property, which Winifred had hoped to retain as her only remaining asset. The third and most immediate challenge presented itself on a snowy December afternoon, when Catherine fell ill with a fever that left her flushed and listless. The doctor was called, remedies were administered, but the child's condition worsened as night fell. Winifred remained at her bedside, bathing her forehead with cool cloths and monitoring her breathing. The Duke joined her near midnight, his face drawn with concern. "No improvement?" he asked softly. Winifred shook her head, passing him her slate. "The fever rises still. I've been giving her the willow bark tea as directed, but it provides only temporary relief." His eyes, shadowed with fatigue, met hers. "You should rest." I can watch over her." She shook her head firmly and wrote, "I will stay. You have matters to attend to in the morning. One of us should be alert." "My ward's health supersedes all other concerns," he said, but the argument lacked conviction. He had an important meeting with government officials regarding a railway proposal that could not be postponed. They reached a compromise. The Duke would rest for a few hours while Winifred maintained her vigil, then they would trade places before dawn. But as the night deepened and Catherine's fever spiked dangerously high, Winifred made a decision that would alter the course of her life. The child's breathing had become labored, her small body radiating heat despite the cooling measures. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and a remedy that Winifred had learned from her mother, one the doctors might dismiss as country superstition. She hurried to her room, returning with a small wooden box containing dried herbs. Working quickly, she prepared a poultice of elderflowers, yarrow, and peppermint, then gently applied it to Catherine's chest and throat. Next, she mixed a tincture in water and, supporting the child's head, helped her swallow small sips. "What are you doing?" The Duke's voice, sharp with alarm, came from the doorway. He had returned earlier than agreed, his concern for Catherine evidently outweighing his need for rest. Winifred had no free hand for her slate. She met his gaze steadily, willing him to trust her. "Those are not the doctor's remedies," he said, approaching the bed with quick strides. "Explain yourself, Miss Kingston." The moment hung between them, taut with tension. Then, for the first time in nearly a year, Winifred Kingston spoke aloud. "It's a remedy my mother used when I had lung fever as a child," she said, her voice rusty from disuse but clear enough. "The fever will break within the hour, if I'm correct about the nature of Catherine's illness." The Duke stared at her in astonishment, clearly shocked by both her voice and her actions. "You spoke?" "Yes," she turned her attention back to Catherine, adjusting the poultice. "And I will explain everything later, but at this moment, your ward's health is our priority. Will you trust me, Your Grace? Just for this hour." He studied her face, searching for something, certainty, perhaps, or conviction. Whatever he sought, he seemed to find it, for he gave a curt nod. 1 hour. "But if her condition worsens in any way?" "It won't," Winifred said with quiet confidence. "Please sit with her, speak to her. Let her hear your voice while the remedy works." To her surprise, he complied without further argument, taking the chair beside the bed and beginning to talk softly to Catherine about a pony she would receive for Christmas, a promised trip to the seaside in summer, the stars they would observe together when she was well again. Winifred withdrew to the window, giving them privacy while still monitoring the child's condition. Outside, snow fell in thick flakes, blanketing London in pristine white that would turn to grey slush by morning. Inside, time seemed suspended as they waited for either vindication or disaster. 40 minutes later, Catherine's breathing eased. Within the hour, as promised, her fever broke, her skin cooling as perspiration beaded on her forehead. She fell into a natural, restful sleep for the first time in 2 days. The Duke rose from his chair, his expression a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering wariness. "It seems I owe you an apology, Miss Kingston, and my profound thanks." "Neither is necessary," she replied softly. "I only did what anyone would do for a child in their care." Not anyone would have had the knowledge or the courage to act against conventional wisdom. He moved closer, studying her with new interest. "You spoke. After all this time, you spoke." "Yes," she met his gaze directly. "Some circumstances transcend personal vows." "And was it a vow, your silence?" "Of a sort." She glanced at Catherine's peaceful form. "I should prepare a fresh cooling cloth for when she wakes. The fever may have broken, but she'll need care for several more days." "Miss Kingston," his voice halted her retreat. "Winifred, we will speak of this tomorrow." "At length." The sound of her given name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her. She nodded once, then slipped from the room, aware that in saving Catherine, she had irrevocably altered her own carefully constructed sanctuary of silence. True to his word, the Duke summoned Winifred to his study the following afternoon. Catherine was recovering well, already demanding paper and pencils to draw from her sickbed, her energy returning by the hour. "Please sit," he said when she entered. Gone was the distant employer of their early acquaintance, replaced by a man whose penetrating gaze suggested he would accept nothing less than complete honesty. "I believe we have much to discuss." Winifred took the offered seat, her hands folded primly in her lap. "I imagine you have questions, Your Grace." "Several." He remained standing, too restless to sit. Beginning with why a woman clearly capable of speech would choose to live in silence for nearly a year. She had anticipated this question and had prepared her answer, but now, faced with his direct inquiry, she found herself hesitating. The truth was complicated, layered with pride and pain, and a fierce determination to protect what little dignity remained to her. "When my father's crimes were discovered," she began slowly, "I was interrogated by authorities who had already determined my guilt by association. Every protest of innocence, every explanation was twisted or dismissed. I watched my words being used as weapons against me in the court of public opinion." She rose and moved to the window, needing space to continue. "After the third day of questioning, after reading yet another newspaper account describing me as the embezzler's duplicitous daughter, I simply stopped. I stopped defending myself. I stopped explaining. I stopped speaking entirely." "As a protest?" he asked, his voice closer now. He had moved to stand behind her. "As a reclamation," she corrected. "My words were the only thing left that was truly mine. By withholding them, I denied society the satisfaction of distorting them further." She turned to face him. "It began as shock, transformed into necessity, and eventually became choice." "Until Catherine needed you more than you needed your silence," he observed. "Yes." He studied her face with an intensity that might have been discomforting had she not grown accustomed to his direct manner over the months of her employment. "And now? Will you continue to speak, or return to silence?" It was a question she had asked herself throughout the sleepless night. "I'm not certain," she admitted. "Habits of self-preservation are not easily abandoned, even when they no longer serve their purpose." "Especially then," she replied. "Familiar discomfort often feels safer than uncertain change." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "For someone who has not spoken in months, you express yourself with remarkable eloquence, Miss Kingston." "I have had ample time to compose my thoughts, Your Grace." "Connor." She blinked, startled. "I beg your pardon. My name is Connor. When we are in private, I would prefer you use it." The request, so improper, so unexpected, momentarily robbed her of the voice she had only just reclaimed. That would be most inappropriate. "Perhaps." He moved closer still, close enough that she could see the varying shades of grey in his eyes, like storm clouds gathering. "But after last night, I think we have moved beyond mere employer and employee, don't you? You saved Catherine's life. You broke your vow of silence to do so." "I merely did what was necessary." "As did I when I hired you." His expression grew serious. "I knew your father, Winifred, not well, but enough to recognize that his charm concealed a fundamental dishonesty. And I knew, the moment I read about the scandal, that you could not have been complicit." Her heart stuttered. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I remembered you from that day at your father's home. You served tea with trembling hands and answered his blustering questions with quiet dignity. There was an authenticity to you that contrasted sharply with his performance of respectability." He paused. "That is why I sought you out at Lady Harlington's ball, not merely for Catherine's sake, though that need was genuine, but because I recognized an injustice that I had the power to partially correct." Winifred struggled to process this revelation. "You offered me employment because you believed in my innocence, before you even knew if I was qualified. I made inquiries about your education and character before approaching you, he clarified. I do not act on impulse alone. But yes, my initial interest was sparked by the conviction that you had been wrongly condemned. She turned away, overwhelmed by the implications of his confession. I don't know whether to thank you or be offended that you appointed yourself my savior without my knowledge or consent. Neither response is required, he said. I merely wanted you to understand that your voice, whether spoken or unspoken, has always carried weight with me. The sentiment was so unexpected, so contrary to her experience of the past year, that Winifred found tears threatening. She blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to display such vulnerability. Catherine will be wondering where I am, she said, retreating behind practicality. She was asking for her drawing materials when I left her. The Duke, Connor, accepted her deflection with a nod. Of course, but Winifred. She paused at the door, not turning. I hope you will continue to speak, at least within these walls. Your voice should be heard. She departed without answering, her mind awhirl with conflicting emotions. The Duke's revelation had shaken the very foundation of her carefully constructed worldview. If he had seen her, truly seen her, when all others had been blinded by scandal and assumption, what did that mean? And why did the knowledge fill her with both gratitude and trepidation? The answers would have to wait. For now, Catherine needed her, and in that simple fact, Winifred found refuge from the storm of her thoughts. The Christmas season brought new complications to Carlisle House. The Duke hosted a series of small gatherings, necessary obligations to maintain his social and political connections. Winifred remained in the background during these events, supervising Catherine when her presence was required and otherwise keeping to the schoolroom and her quarters. She had continued speaking, though selectively, freely with Catherine, carefully with the Duke, and only when necessary with the rest of the household. Her voice felt strange to her still, like a garment long unworn and not yet reshaped to fit her properly. Catherine, delighted by this new development, had redoubled her own efforts at communication. Though she still did not speak, she had begun using more complex hand signals and writing longer sentences to express her thoughts. The bond between governess and pupil had deepened into something approaching family affection, a dangerous attachment, Winifred knew, but one she could not bring herself to guard against. Her relationship with the Duke had shifted as well, acquiring layers of complexity that both intrigued and alarmed her. He sought her company more frequently, finding reasons to join Catherine's lessons or inviting Winifred to provide her opinion on books he was reading. Their conversations ranged from philosophy to politics, from art to science, revealing a compatibility of mind that Winifred found increasingly difficult to ignore. It was during one such conversation, as they discussed a controversial new novel while Catherine dozed by the fire after an afternoon of sledding in the garden, that the Duke asked a question that pierced through Winifred's carefully maintained defenses. "What will you do when you leave us?" She looked up from her embroidery, startled. "Leave? Have I given some offense that warrants dismissal?" "Not at all," he assured her quickly. "But Catherine will eventually outgrow the need for a governess. She will attend school or have more specialized tutors as she grows older. I merely wondered what plans you have made for your future." The question struck at the heart of Winifred's deepest anxieties. Her future beyond Carlisle House was a nebulous void she had avoided contemplating, knowing that her options remained severely limited by her father's disgrace. "I have some small savings," she said carefully. "Perhaps enough to secure passage to America or one of the colonies, where my name might not be a barrier to respectable employment." "You would leave England?" The dismay in his voice was unmistakable. "Surely that's unnecessary. Your situation here has improved. There would be other positions." "Would there?" She interrupted, setting aside her pretense of calm. One favorable reference cannot erase a scandal of this magnitude. Most households would still consider me a risk to their reputation. Then they are fools, he said flatly, and unworthy of your service. Winifred shook her head. You are unusually liberal in your views, Your Grace. Most of society is not so forgiving of association with financial impropriety. Connor, he reminded her, and perhaps I simply recognize quality of character when I see it. His gaze held hers, intense and unguarded, revealing an admiration that went far beyond an employer's appreciation of a competent employee. Winifred felt heat rising in her cheeks and looked away, focusing on Catherine's peaceful form. The child grows more like you every day, she observed, deliberately changing the subject. She has your determination and your thoughtfulness. And my stubbornness, according to my sister, he said, allowing the diversion. Though I suspect she's acquired some of your patience during your time together. She is a remarkable child, Winifred agreed. She will overcome her silence when she is ready, I believe. Perhaps when the memories that stole her voice have lost some of their power. As you have overcome yours. The question hung between them, weighted with meanings neither was prepared to fully acknowledge. I have not overcome it so much as adapted it, she replied finally. I speak when speaking serves a purpose greater than silence. And this conversation, does it serve a purpose? Winifred met his gaze directly. I don't yet know. That remains to be seen, doesn't it? Before he could respond, the butler appeared at the doorway, announcing the arrival of an unexpected visitor, Lady Victoria, bearing news and a flurry of snow on her elegant fur-trimmed mantle. Connor, you'll never guess what I've discovered, she announced, sweeping into the room before noticing Winifred's presence. Oh, Miss Kingston. I didn't realize you were here. Miss Kingston and I were discussing Catherine's progress, the Duke said smoothly, but she was just leaving to prepare for tomorrow's lessons. The dismissal, though gently delivered, strung. Winifred gathered her embroidery and rose, curtsying to both siblings before departing. Catherine's warm weight gathered carefully in her arms to return the sleeping child to her bed. As she closed the drawing-room door behind her, she heard Lady Victoria's excited whisper, Connor, I've found him. I've found Kingston. Winifred froze, her heart thundering in her chest. Father Kingston has been traced to Geneva. Apparently he's living quite comfortably under an assumed name, but one of Henry's banking connections recognized him from the newspaper accounts. Isn't that extraordinary? Indeed, came the Duke's measured response. And what do you propose we do with this information? Do? Why, inform the authorities, of course. The man swindled half of London society. He should face justice. And what of his daughter? There was a pause before Lady Victoria replied, her voice lowered but still audible through the door. What of her? She claims no knowledge of his crimes. If that's true, then justice for him need not affect her. In an ideal world, perhaps, but we both know society is rarely so discerning in its judgments. Winifred had heard enough. She moved quickly down the corridor, her mind racing. Her father found. After all this time, after all the damage he had caused, he had been living in comfort while she weathered the storm of his making. Rage and emotion she had suppressed beneath layers of stoicism surged through her with unexpected force. Not only had he abandoned her to face the consequences of his actions, but he had clearly taken enough money to establish himself comfortably abroad. Money that rightfully belonged to his victims. By the time she reached Catherine's room and gently laid the still sleeping child in her bed, Winifred's anger had crystallized into resolve. Her father must face justice, not only for his victims, but for her own peace of mind. And if that meant a fresh wave of scandal would engulf her just as she was beginning to rebuild her life, then so be it. The Duke found her an hour later in the library, writing furiously by lamplight. He entered quietly, closing the door behind him with a soft click that alerted her to his presence. You heard, he said, not a question but a statement. Winifred set down her pen and turned to face him. Yes. Your sister's voice carries when she's excited. Victoria can be indiscreet. He moved to stand beside her desk, glancing at the pages covered in her neat script. What are you writing? A statement, she replied. Everything I know about my father's business dealings, his associates, his patterns of behavior. It's not much. He was careful to keep his professional life separate from his home, but perhaps there are details that might help authorities build their case when he is apprehended. The Duke studied her face. You wish him to be found and tried? Of course I do. Did you think I would protect him after what he did? The question emerged more sharply than intended, edged with the hurt of his apparent doubt. No, he said quietly. But I thought you might wish to avoid the renewed attention his capture would bring to you. The newspapers will resurrect the entire scandal. Let them, Winifred said, lifting her chin. I have nothing to hide. And I will not allow fear of gossip to prevent justice being served. His expression softened into something close to admiration. Your courage continues to astonish me. It isn't courage, she countered. It's necessity. I cannot truly begin again until this chapter is closed completely. Then we are in agreement. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document, placing it before her. This is a letter I've drafted to the Home Secretary, who is a personal friend. It contains the information Victoria brought, along with my request that the matter be handled with discretion, particularly regarding your involvement. Winifred stared at the letter, then at the Duke's face, confusion giving way to understanding. You were already planning to report his whereabouts. Of course. Did you think I would withhold such information from the authorities? No, but, she hesitated. I thought you might delay out of concern for the disruption it would cause in your household. For Catherine's sake, if not for mine. Catherine is stronger than you realize, he said. As are you, and principles must sometimes take precedence over comfort. He paused, his expression growing more serious. There is something else you should know. When your father is apprehended, there will likely be assets recovered. Not enough to repay all his victims, but perhaps sufficient to release your mother's cottage from the creditor's claims. Hope, dangerous and unwelcome, fluttered in Winifred's chest. How could you possibly know that? Because I purchased the majority of the outstanding claims against your father's estate, he said simply, as a means of protecting your interests when the time came. She stared at him, momentarily speechless. You what, when, why? Shortly after you came into my employment. As for why, he met her gaze directly. Initially, it was to ensure that you would not be further victimized by creditors who might seek to claim your salary or future earnings. Later, it became something more, a way to secure something of your past that I knew you valued. Winifred rose from her chair, too agitated to remain seated. Do you make a habit of interfering in your employees' financial affairs without their knowledge or consent? No, he admitted. This was a unique situation. Because you pitied me, the thought was unbearable. Because I admired you, he corrected firmly. Because I recognized in you a dignity and resilience that deserved protection. And yes, because I wanted to help. And this was a way I could do so without wounding your pride by offering charity. His honesty disarmed her anger, though confusion remained. I don't understand you, she said finally. Your actions toward me have gone far beyond the obligations of an employer. Yes, he agreed quietly, they have. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Winifred turned away, unable to face the intensity of his gaze. Catherine will need reassurance when this becomes public, she said, retreating to safer ground. Children are sensitive to disruption, and she's only just beginning to feel secure again. We will face that challenge together, he said, accepting her deflection for the moment. For now, I will add your statement to my letter, if you're satisfied with it." Winifred nodded, gathering the pages she had written and handing them to him with slightly trembling fingers. "It's all there. Everything I can recall that might be of use." As he took the papers, his fingers brushed hers, a brief contact that sent an undeniable current of awareness through her. From his momentary stillness, she knew he had felt it too. "Winifred," he began, his voice lower, more intimate. "Please," she interrupted, stepping back. "Not now. There is too much uncertainty ahead to contemplate anything else." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "As you wish. But when this is resolved, and it will be resolved, we will finish this conversation." It was both promise and warning, and Winifred found herself both dreading and anticipating that future moment with equal intensity. The arrest of Frederick Kingston in Geneva 3 weeks later caused exactly the sensation Winifred had anticipated. Newspapers that had long since relegated the embezzlement scandal to their back pages now trumpeted his capture with gleeful headlines, rehashing the original crimes and speculating wildly about his time as a fugitive. Inevitably, Winifred's name appeared in these accounts, though the Duke's influence with the Home Secretary had ensured that her cooperation with authorities was presented in the most favorable light possible. Still, invitations to the events she had occasionally accompanied Catherine to were quietly rescinded, and callers to Carlisle House suddenly found reasons to visit when the governess was sure to be occupied with lessons. Through it all, the Duke remained steadfast in his support, making it clear to his social circle that Miss Kingston retained his complete confidence. It was a powerful statement from a man of his position, and if it couldn't entirely stem the tide of gossip, it at least prevented the worst excesses of social ostracism. Catherine, as predicted, had questions written in her careful script on her slate. "Why are people saying bad things about you? Did your father really steal money? Are you going to leave us?" Winifred answered each query honestly but simply, explaining that sometimes people did wrong things and that families often suffered for the mistakes of one member, but that she had no intention of leaving unless the Duke dismissed her. "And that," said Connor firmly when Catherine showed him this exchange, "is not going to happen. Miss Kingston belongs here with us." The child's smile at this declaration was brighter than Winifred had seen in months. As winter gave way to early spring, preparations for Frederick Kingston's trial dominated legal circles. Winifred provided a formal deposition, but was spared the ordeal of testifying in person, thanks once again to the Duke's intervention. Her father, confronted with overwhelming evidence, ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges, receiving a sentence of 14 years transportation to Australia. The day the verdict was announced, Winifred felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not completely, but enough to allow her to breathe more freely than she had in over a year. The cottage in Derbyshire would be returned to her ownership once the legal formalities were completed. Her father would face the consequences of his actions. Justice, imperfect but real, had been served. That evening, after Catherine had been put to bed, the Duke invited Winifred to join him in the library. She found him standing by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand, his expression pensive. "I thought you might wish for company tonight," he said as she entered. "Today's news must have stirred complicated feelings." "Yes," she admitted, accepting the seat he offered near the fire. "Relief, primarily. But also sadness for what might have been had he made different choices." "Understandable." He took the chair opposite hers. "What will you do now, Winifred? With your name cleared and your property restored, your options are considerably expanded." The question echoed their conversation from months before, but now carried additional weight, additional meaning. Winifred considered her response carefully. "I made a promise to Catherine," she said, "that I would remain as her governess as long as I was needed. I intend to honor that promise." "And if you were needed in another capacity?" His voice was measured, deliberate. "If Catherine and others in this household needed you to fulfill a different role entirely?" Winifred's heart stuttered in her chest. What role would that be, exactly? Instead of answering directly, Connor set aside his glass and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. I promised we would finish our conversation when the matter of your father was resolved. That time has come. Connor, she began, but he shook his head. Please, let me speak. When you came into this house, you were a woman who had chosen silence as her shield against a world that had wounded her deeply. I respected that choice, even as I hoped you would eventually find your voice again. His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. What I did not expect was how profoundly that voice, when finally heard, would affect me. How your courage, your principles, your unwavering dedication to Catherine would transform my understanding of what matters most in life. Winifred sat very still, scarcely daring to breathe as he continued. I have lived by rigid codes of duty and propriety, he said. I have made decisions based on what society expects of a man in my position rather than what my heart desires. But you, in your dignified silence and your thoughtful speech, have taught me the importance of authenticity, of living in accordance with one's true nature rather than external expectations. He released one of her hands to reach into his waistcoat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Winifred Kingston, I am asking you to remain at Carlisle House not as a governess, but as my wife, my partner, my duchess. Will you do me the profound honor of accepting my hand in marriage? For a woman who had once embraced silence as her closest companion, Winifred found herself momentarily without words, not from choice, but from overwhelming emotion. Tears filled her eyes as she gazed at the man kneeling before her, this duke who had seen her worth when all others saw only scandal, who had given her purpose when she had lost all direction. Society will never accept such a match, she said when she found her voice. No matter that my father's crimes were not mine, I remain tainted by association. You would face criticism, perhaps even ostracism from certain circles. Let them criticize, Connor replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. Those who would judge me for choosing a woman of your character are not people whose opinions I value. Besides, he added with a hint of the dry humor she had come to cherish, I am a duke. Society may gossip, but they will adapt. They always do. And Catherine, have you considered how this would affect her? His expression softened. Catherine adores you. When I broached the subject theoretically, asking how she would feel if you were to become a more permanent part of our family, she filled 3 pages with exclamation marks and drawings of the 3 of us holding hands. I believe her approval is quite secure. Winifred laughed despite her tears, imagining the child's enthusiastic response. You discussed this with her before speaking to me. I needed to be certain that all parties most affected would welcome the arrangement. He opened the velvet box, revealing a ring of sapphires surrounding a central diamond. I'm still waiting for one very important answer, however. Looking at the man before her, this complicated, principled, unexpectedly tender man who had offered her not just rescue but recognition, not just security but love, Winifred made the easiest decision of her life. Yes, she said, her voice clear and confident, no longer rusty from disuse but strong with conviction. Yes, I will marry you, Connor. His smile, as he slipped the ring onto her finger, was brighter than any she had seen grace his usually serious features. Rising, he drew her to her feet and into his embrace, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke more eloquently than words of the journey they had traveled from employer and employee to equals in love. When they finally parted, slightly breathless, Winifred rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I never imagined this, she confessed. When I chose silence, I thought I was choosing a life of isolation, of protection through distance. I never dreamed that in losing my voice, I would eventually find not only it again, but also a home, a family, a future. Sometimes, Connor said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, we must lose what we think defines us to discover who we truly are. He tilted her chin up, meeting her gaze with tender intensity. You were never defined by your silence, Winifred, nor by your father's actions. You were always defined by your integrity, your courage, your capacity for love. Those are the qualities I fell in love with, whether they were expressed in silence or in speech. Outside the library windows, spring rain fell softly, washing away the last vestiges of winter's grip on London. Inside, wrapped in the arms of the man who had seen her truth when she could not speak it, Winifred Kingston found the one thing she had believed forever lost to her: a voice that was heard, a heart that was understood, and a love that transcended society's narrow judgments. 3 months later, in the private chapel at the Duke's country estate, Winifred Kingston became the Duchess of Carlisle in a ceremony attended by a small gathering of true friends and family. Catherine, radiant in her role as flower girl, surprised everyone by speaking her first words in over 2 years, a clear, joyful, "I love you both," as she presented the rings. There would be battles ahead, adjustments to make, society's whispers to face with dignity. But as Winifred and Connor exchanged their vows, their voices equally strong in their promises to one another, they did so with the certainty that, having found each other through silence and scandal, they could face whatever challenges arose, together, voice by voice, heart by heart, day by day.